On this week's Force.com cast episode, we're going to talk about API versions, and one of the things you need to be aware of when dealing with Salesforce and its different API versions throughout the new releases. So I was on the developer forums the other day answering a few questions, and there was a particular question that came up, which was answered by changing the API version. And Salesforce obviously releases 3 new updates every year, which is a phenomenal feat in itself. And every time they do so, they release a new API version number. So if you were to have a look at one of your Apex classes or a Visualforce page, you'll see that there's a version number here for the Salesforce API. So so 3 times a year we get new functionality and new features in there. But using that version API as well, your code decides what fields are available to it. So one of the things that I've seen done a lot in production instances, in large-scale deployments, and in product code is something called a utility class, such as this, where you pass in a string object name and it builds out a query string for you that lists out all of the fields. So similar to the select star syntax from SQL. And the reason people do this quite often is that they want to retrieve all of the fields. Fields might be being added at different times. They want to be able to make sure they can get them. And it's important to be able to reuse your code and be dry and all these other things we've mentioned in previous videos. So we've got this method here, which is, as I say, similar to ones I've seen used in production. And if we do some execute anonymous work now, using the developer console, what we can do is we can run that to output our query string, and it will go away and work in the background. And if we view the log, it'll load. And we can check the debug and see that we get a nice long string, which is all of the fields. So that's perfect. So we've retrieved all of our account fields, and we could run that as a query. Now, excuse me, we have another class here, which is could be any class. It could be the controller that was calling this method. It could be another utility class that we're using in an identity map fashion. And basically, we've got some other class that's calling our utility class to run the query. And so what it does is it calls out, asks for the particular query string, and then this class would run it. Now what's important to note is that this is on a different version. So I've got this class on API version 29, and I have this class on API version 31. So if we go back to our debug log now, what we can do is run this, and we'll see that we get a query exception. There's no such column called photo URL on the account. Well, if you were to go in and use something like Force.com Explorer or the Workbench to have a look through the account, there is a photo URL field on there. So where's this error coming from? Well, if we also run it again and just swap out statements, and we'll use the run query method on our SOQL utility class, which, if you have a look, is exactly the same code. We see that it runs fine, and it will retrieve a bunch of data for us. So what's happening in the difference? Why is one failing and one working? Well, the answer is all to do with that API version. So because our class that's creating the query string is an API version 31, when it interrogates the S object, it sees all of the fields that have been added all the way up to and including API version 31. So that includes the photo URL field, which was added in API version 30. So that will go away. When it's looping through doing a schema describe, it'll be able to see that field. That will then pass that string back, which has no knowledge of what version of the API it's in, over to our retriever class, which, as I say, could be a controller, could be a trigger, could be anything, and that is in version 29. So when that calls database.query, the database querying system will only be able to retrieve fields or see fields up to version 29. So this means that it won't be able to see the photo URL field, and it will error. So obviously there's a simple way of fixing this. It's to go in and make sure that we update the version to be version 31, or even version 30, but we'll update it to 31 as there's nothing else in this class. And if we go back into here and rerun with the account retriever, it will go away and retrieve the accounts for us. And if we were to look at the debug log for that, it would be pretty much the same. So the point of this is that, I've been asked a few times by different people, do I ever need to update the version number? What's the point of updating the version number? And most of the time they're okay. They don't have to worry about it. If you're just using standard Salesforce, it's a problem you'll never really come across. If you're using hard-coded SQL queries so that you're writing your SQL statements in line and not using the database query methods, then again, you're more than likely to be fine. What you've got to be careful of, however, is when you're writing dynamic SQL or parsing results backwards and forwards between classes, whether on different API versions. I used to run and build products on the platform, and this was something we were constantly having to be aware of, just because you need to make sure you test thoroughly. So the long and short of it is that whenever there's a new API version out there, make sure you go through your system, have a look to see if you've got any dynamic queries or any points where bunches of data are being passed in between classes and you're adding new classes on, just to make sure that you can retrieve the correct fields. That's the end of this week's Force.com cast, and I hope you enjoyed it.